Good evening. Welcome to Church History, His Tree. We are on Lecture 6, and we are going to discuss today the 1600s. Now, in the past, remember, we have discussed such huge time frames. This is 100 years. And if you have your tree, remember, we had the seed is Christ, the roots of the early church. We went through the trunk, early Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, went to the Renaissance, and then last week we covered the Reformation. And this week we're on the leaves, which is the 1600s, the Puritan era, and the New World. Yes. Now, I hope that you have your tree, because I think it's really important to think in timelines. And I'm going to start this lecture tonight with just a big overview of what we covered for Reformation, which was 1500s. And then we will go a little bit into the 1600s, and then I will cover the 16s tonight. So I'm going to go, now I sent out handouts to you, and you have them. And the one thing I did send you was this, which is a timeline. And it was the timeline for Johann Sebastian Bach. Well, when you, I told you on the other lecture, when you study a person like Martin Luther or Johann Sebastian Bach, then you study the world around them. It's an extremely good way of getting a real picture of that period and locking it into your brain, because that's the goal. So we're going to cover a lot of ground here, but I'm going to start by saying the 1600s, I thought, how can I help my students remember? And I thought, let's do 5 P's for the 1600s. I see things in pictures. And it came to me. We have, at the beginning, the protesters and the Protestant Reformation. That's a P, okay? Protestant Reformation. Out of that, we're going to find that we have the Pilgrims. And that's 1620 and in there and on. Then in the middle of the century, we're going to have the Puritan movement in England, and it affects America. And then we are going to have, we already had printing, which has helped so much, and there's more printing presses being set up. And out of that, we had a lot of pamphlets. And then we had preachers. And preachers come when they are excited and have something to say. And what made these people excited was God's word, setting them free and delivering them from oppression of being under a king or a pope or being a peasant. But no, they discovered through the Protestant Reformation they were free in Christ. Yes. And I have a little music playing. Now, it's not exactly 1600s, but it relates. It's Haydn, his great cello concerto. He comes a little later, but then Boccherini, who also is doing a beautiful cello concerto here. And Boccherini, of course, is coming right out of that Renaissance, and Haydn's coming right out of the Reformation. So that's why I thought it was really appropriate to have that playing in the background. So let's go through it again. Protesters or Protestant Reformation, that's 1. 2 is the Pilgrims. 3 is the Puritans. 4 is the printing. and printing presses going around, and 5 are the preachers. And many of the people started writing tracts. And a tract is T-R-A-C-T. It would be like a pamphlet. Someone wrote their ideas. Kind of like today we would maybe post on the YouTube, or more like a text, but then we want to send it out, and so it would be like a tweet, or on TikTok, getting a message out. Well, because of the printing presses, they could write out their message and hand it out. And last week I said, Martin Luther discovered he could write a paper in Germany, and it could be on the streets of Barcelona, Spain. It could be there in 2 weeks. Yes, is that incredible? Yeah. So, and also all down to Italy and all the other major cities. So, let's start by I think I'll review here with you just what happened in the 1600s. We will go, well, we can go back a bit. We had the Gutenberg printing press, 1455. Martin Luther is born 1483. I'm going to skip ahead. And Luther started publishing in 1526. He published the Latin Mass for the church in Wittenberg, and that was for the people to be able to really understand that they could pray directly to God. 1527, Luther writes the hymn, A Mighty Fortress, and then in 1529, Luther published the Large and Small Catechism. 1534, the German Bible, and then in 1534, the break was between the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church. 1536, Calvin published the Institutes of the Christian Religion. And 1539, Luther preaches at St. Thomas's Church in Leipzig. Now that's big because that's going to be the church that Johann Sebastian Bach does all of his music out of 125 years later. Okay? And then Copernicus's model was established. Luther died in 1546. The Peace of Augsburg came 1555, and that gave the Catholic and Lutheran rulers in Germany the right to choose their territory's religion. And this still happens in Switzerland, the cantons. They vote every few years to either let the cathedral be Catholic or Protestant. Okay, now, in 1595, Michael Praetorius becomes organist at the Wolfenbüttel, and that is a big thing because Michael Praetorius, when you start singing out of a German hymn book, you'll see his name all over it. He wrote the most beautiful melodies and hymns. Okay, 1597, the first opera, Daphne, is performed in Florence, Italy. So opera comes out of the south, but out of the north is going to come these tremendous oratorios and really the great church music, Reformation music. Okay, now we're going to start on 1600, okay? Shakespeare writes Hamlet in 1600. 1603, Queen Elizabeth I of England dies. 1607, Paul Gerhardt, writer of the hymn, O Sacred Head, Thou Wounded, is born. But I think it was based on a prayer that Bernard of Clairvaux had written about 300 years or 400 years before. 1611, the King James Bible is published. 1618, the beginning of the 30 Years' War in Europe. 1642, the English Civil War begins. 1647, the Westminster Confession becomes the standard of Presbyterian faith in Scotland. That's big. 1648, the Peace of Westphalia ends the 30 Years' War. 1667, Milton publishes Paradise Lost. 1688, Dietrich Buxtehude becomes organist at St. Mary's Church in Lübeck, Germany, and he's the man who inspires Johann Sebastian Bach. Because as a young boy, Bach was a singer and played the violin. And then he went to hear this great organist when he was older, and he fell in love with the pipe organ, and the rest is history. That he said, this is the instrument that I can express my full heart on. And even at that, it is said that Bach could hear notes above the keyboard and below. But the keyboard then was smaller than it is now. So that might have been something to do with why the keyboard was changed. Okay, 1669, the famous artist, Dutch artist Rembrandt dies. Now in 1680, Antonio Stradivari begins making violins, and that's from the south again, Florence. 1680, Johann Pachelbel writes the famous Canon in D major. 1685, Johann Sebastian Bach is born in Eisenach, Germany. 1685, George Friedrich Handel is born in Halle, Germany. Now they're born the same year. You know, we're going to find this again and again in church history. Sometimes the two greatest men of an era are born the same year. I'll just tell you a little glance ahead that in 1703, John Wesley was born in England and Jonathan Edwards was born in America, the two great preachers of the 1700s. It's interesting. 1687, Newton publishes the theories on motion and gravity. 1695, Bach's father dies. Bach goes to live with his brother Johann Christoph in Ohrdruf. And then we leave on this sheet the 1600s, but it continues through the 17s. Because really, next week is going to be the big lecture on Bach because he's in the 1700s. But for today, what we want to talk about is the 1600s, and I have to give you a big overview again because I tell you there is just, you're going to see, it's the big, I called it the 1600s is the fruit and the flower. It's the beginning, the fruit and the flower of the Protestant Reformation. Yes. Okay. The 1600s are the green leaves appearing from 100 years of the Bible being in the hands of the people. Because in 1454, remember, Johann Gutenberg created the printing press. And then in 1515, Martin Luther made the statement, and then we read his Bible was published within 10 years after the German Bible. Okay, so the people for 100 years they had become literate. The average person had become literate. That means they could read and write. Okay. And the Textus Receptus, we talked about that last week, Erasmus had completed in 1516, and that's what Martin Luther used to translate his Bible into German. He used that beautiful, brand new Textus Receptus from Erasmus, that was Greek, and at the same time, Rochlin, just a little bit before, had translated and created a Hebrew grammar lexicon, never been before. You had had Hebrew scriptures, but he created a Hebrew grammar lexicon, which is a dictionary of grammar, and the whole Hebrew Bible then, You know, Rock Lean is the scholar of scholars. And I think I told you his nephew is Philip Melanchthon, who is the right-hand man to Martin Luther. And so all of this was coming together. It's like a miracle to create. It wasn't by chance. God did this. And it created a syntax. So from this, we see the modern university emerge. And it's true. You know, people say, oh, you want to have a university education. It goes right back to Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon. Because his close assistant and aide, who was the nephew of this brilliant scholar, Rock Lean, is the designer and vision behind the 5 schools in one place centered in the Bible. You know, they did the Trivium, which is philosophy, physics, metaphysics. That had been going. The Quadrivium, which was, you know, the arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music. But then was added theology, logic, grammar, and rhetoric. And out of this, all these universities sprung, and they modeled themselves after this model. And so this is one of the main points. The Bible always, wherever it goes, it brings healing to the soul, mind, and body. And it always educates. It creates, you can go around the world, almost every country you'll go to. You go to the root of the hospital, even where I live, and we live in America. Most of these hospitals we have were founded by the Catholic sisters, the St. Franciscan order in our area. They're all in the St. Francis. It's the compassion of Jesus to start hospitals. And almost every great university in America and in England was founded on the Bible for the purpose of training ministers. Theology was the queen of the sciences. And you would have then medicine and law follow. But theology, and so many colleges, you will go to small colleges, like my daughter went to a college called Luther College. Well, it's a tremendous college. But in 1868, the Norwegian farmers in this small area of Decorah, Iowa, got together and formed a school, and it was a seminary to train ministers. And out of that came, year after year, adding another division. Now it's a really, really good college. And this is so true. Like Harvard was founded for the purpose of training ministers. Princeton was founded for the purpose of training ministers, as was Yale. And in order to even go to Yale, you know, Jonathan Edwards went to Yale, I believe when he was 12 or 13. You had to know Hebrew and Greek and Latin in order to get into these schools. And then you were expected to have live on the college campus a very moral, upright life. They had high standards of expectation of behavior and a very serious student. And we don't realize, but true education always comes from the Bible. And you know, if you look historically in the Old Testament, the Jews all the way, the Israelites all the way, they have these incredible schools of the prophets, even way back in Ezra and Elijah and Jeremiah. They went to the schools of the prophets. These were a very literate people. And I heard a tremendous lecture once by a linguist, a man, and he said, the Hebrew alphabet, you know, is not complicated. You know, you have just a little bit over 20 some letters, and that's the same with the Greek, and then the same with the English. And so it made it possible for people to understand and to learn and become literate. And the young boys in the Jewish Israel times, Deuteronomy was their book. and they would learn to read by reading Deuteronomy. They would learn to speak rhetoric, and speak with a good voice and a good manner. They would recite, and then they would memorize, and then they would learn to write by copying, and so you had it all contained in a book. Now the Greeks, they used Homer's Iliad, and then they used the Odyssey. And so they didn't have a complicated education. And there was virtue being taught in these books because there was good versus evil, and you wanted to be a good, moral, upright person. So literacy is not difficult. Now in China, they literally have hundreds and hundreds of letters, and this linguist said that even the top scholars in China, very few of them knew all of the letters and all the meaning, and very few could read or write because it was just too difficult. And so I think it's so interesting that wherever the Bible goes, you have healing and health, you have literacy, you have good law and order, because Jesus said, take care of the widow and the orphan, and don't lord it over people, and follow the 10 Commandments. You're not going to steal, cheat, lie, or covet. And then Jesus summed it up and said, I can say all the commandments in one. Remember that? Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and strength, and thy neighbor as thyself. Isn't that great? And you know, the first 4 commandments of the 10 are about our relationship with us and God. And then the last 6 are about our relationship with our fellow man. Simple. God doesn't plan us to have to live a complicated life. And so suddenly, through this Protestant Reformation in the 15 and 1600s, it was almost like the early church again. You had people coming alive that, oh, I'm special to God too, even though I was born very poor and impoverished. Oh, and I can learn to read and write. Oh, and I can lift myself up. Yes. And I can read the Bible and find out that Jesus said that I'm a joint heir with him and that I'm precious to him. I'm one of his jewels, and he wants to provide all my needs and take care of me. Yes, this was radical. This turned the world upside down. Okay, sorry for digressing. Let's get back on my track here. Okay, in England, we have, so that university system was really great. In England, you have a period of literature springing from the great Puritan divines, and that's about from 1620 to about 1660 and on. It is said never before or since has such a level of original, brilliant writing on the part of so many been packed into such a short space. The Pilgrims, because now see, this Puritan period is including, the Pilgrims are about 1620, right? They come on their boat, well, 1619 to be exact, but it's rounded off 1620. And they had their Geneva Bible with John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. It would have been coming to them. Now, he might have written it a little later, but as the other pilgrims came, they had that. Every home in America had the Geneva Bible, the Pilgrim's Progress, along with the Fox's Book of Martyrs. Now, they would have had access to Milton's Paradise Lost later, and they were learning and writing some of the greatest hymns and poems ever penned. This was a highly educated group that trekked their way in a small boat on an uncharted ocean. What gave them the vision for such an undertaking? I always say that. Why would a group of Oxford scholars, that's what they were. These were brilliant men. They were ministers, they were pastors. They didn't want to leave England. They had the Scrooby Church, but there was persecution. And they were burning even people at the stake in England. And they had to secretly meet. And so then remember, they went on their boat and they couldn't get off. So they went over to Holland and lived for a while. But they had this dream and vision, and they had heard about this wonderful country that, and the king, they had gotten permission, they could go and establish a colony there. And so you have mothers, fathers, these people aren't that old when you analyze the ages of the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and you can look that up. Remember, a Puritan is a person that wanted to stay in the Church of England and purify it because it had become very corrupt. The Separatists, they didn't want to be in the Church of England anymore. They wanted to have their own congregation. That would be the Anabaptists and different Presbyterians and different denominations were rising up at that time. And the Pilgrims were, included both of them. And so the Pilgrims were going with the idea of founding a country that would please the Lord. Their purpose was religious freedom. And their purpose was that they could raise their children, because when they went to Holland, the Dutch people were very good to them, and Holland was a very good country, an influential country, but their children started speaking Dutch, and they said, we want our children to retain their English heritage. So that is one of the main reasons they went on this boat. And there's so much I would love to go into, William Brewster, and these great men that led this group, and then so many of them died. And before they even went to land, they sat in their boat and they said, we must draw up a covenant. And that's called the Mayflower Compact, that between us and God we will establish this land for his glory and his good. And they knew that they all had to take care of one another, and their boat went off and they went to a different area that they originally didn't know and didn't really know what was going to happen, and it was getting cold, and then people started getting sick. Remember, I believe almost over half of them died the first winter. They suffered. They paid a high price for this beautiful country called America. There's never been a country like it. And they believed that it was God's country, and they were coming to be free and to have good law and good order and to live a peaceful life. That was their goal. So that was going on in the 1600s. And after the first Pilgrims came, many ships came, and there's a lot to that story. Okay. And when I said that they would have had access to Milton's Paradise Lost, John Milton is a Puritan, and he is considered he was, of all the people in England at that time, he was the most highly educated. He was brilliant. He knew Latin. He knew Greek. He understood the classics. He was just well educated. He had a very good life, and he was very devout and loved God. Well, he wrote the great, great epic, Paradise Lost. And then he suffered because he was a Puritan, and he ended up in prison, and then he went blind, and he was trying to write Paradise Refound. Paradise Lost was about Adam and Eve in the garden and how sin took away their perfect